You knew.
It doesn't matter.
You don't have to face this alone.
The courtroom was silent, in the way storms go quiet before they break. Every seat was filled. Executives in tailored suits, reporters gripping notepads, strangers leaning forward with quiet hunger. They weren't here for justice. They were here for spectacle. At the center of it all stood Zariah Cole. Still, composed, unshaken on the surface, but her fingers, resting lightly against the polished wooden table, betrayed her. They trembled just enough to reveal the truth she refused to show the room. Across from her sat Ethan Cole, her husband, or rather, the man who was about to erase that title without a second thought. Ethan didn't look at her. Not once. Instead, his attention lingered on Clara Voss, the woman seated just behind him, dressed in soft elegance, her posture poised, her expression carefully sympathetic. Every now and then, Ethan leaned slightly toward her, whispering something that made her lips curve faintly. That subtle closeness said everything words didn't need to. Zariah saw it. Of course she did, but she didn't react. Not when the judge adjusted his glasses, not when the room shifted with anticipation, not even when Ethan finally stood. "This marriage," Ethan began, his voice calm, too calm, cutting clean through the silence, "was a mistake from the beginning." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Zariah didn't flinch. Ethan continued, his tone sharpening just enough to sting. "I built everything I have with my own hands. Every deal, every risk, every sleepless night." He paused, letting his words settle, letting the audience absorb his version of the truth. And somewhere along the way, I realized I was carrying dead weight. That was when the whispers started. Soft, judgmental, curious. Zariah remained still. Her eyes didn't drop. Her shoulders didn't fold. But something behind her gaze shifted. Ethan turned slightly, just enough to glance back at Clara. A fleeting look. Approval. Validation. Then back to the judge. I refused to keep pretending this partnership ever made sense. The word partnership landed like an insult, because everyone in that room knew what Zariah had been. She wasn't just a partner. She had been there before the first contract, before the investors, before the name Ethan Cole meant anything beyond ambition and unpaid bills. But none of that lived in Ethan's voice now. He spoke like she had simply existed in the background, replaceable, forgettable. Zariah finally moved, not dramatically, not emotionally. She reached for the pen placed neatly beside the documents, the divorce papers. Her name was already printed there, waiting. The judge glanced at her. "Mrs. Cole, do you wish to respond?" The entire room leaned in. This was the moment they expected. Tears, anger, a desperate defense. But Zariah, she said nothing, not a single word. She didn't look at Ethan, didn't acknowledge Clara, didn't even acknowledge the weight of what was happening. Instead, she signed, smooth, controlled, final. The sound of pen against paper echoed louder than any argument could have. A quiet ending, or at least, that's what everyone believed. Ethan exhaled, almost satisfied, like a man who had just removed something inconvenient from his life. The judge nodded, marking the document. "It's done." Just like that. Years of loyalty, reduced to ink drying on paper. Zariah placed the pen down carefully. Then she stood, no hesitation, no collapse, no visible fracture. And for the first time since the hearing began, Ethan looked at her, really looked, perhaps expecting something. Regret, weakness, anything. But what he found instead unsettled him. Because Zariah didn't look broken. She looked distant, like someone who had already walked away long before this moment arrived. She turned, and without a word, she walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind silence, leaving behind whispers, leaving behind a man who thought he had just won. Less than 24 hours later, the world Zariah had quietly exited was already moving on without her. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. The Cole Group headquarters stood tall against the morning sky, its glass exterior reflecting power, dominance, and the illusion of permanence. Inside, the energy had shifted, lighter, sharper, almost celebratory. Employees moved faster, spoke more freely, Conversations carried a subtle undertone of approval, as if a silent weight had been lifted now that Zariah was gone. At the top floor, Ethan adjusted his cufflinks in the reflection of his office window. Calm, controlled, victorious. Behind him, Clara stepped in, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. "You handled yesterday perfectly," she said gently, her voice smooth with admiration. "The board is impressed." Ethan allowed a faint smile. "They should be." Clara moved closer, standing beside him, her presence deliberate. "You finally cut off what was holding you back." For a brief moment, Ethan didn't respond. Then, a knock interrupted them. Sharp, urgent. Ethan frowned slightly. "Come in." The door opened, revealing his assistant, tense, breath slightly uneven. "Sir." "There's someone here to see you." Ethan didn't turn. "Tell them to schedule an appointment." The assistant hesitated. "He says he doesn't need one." That caught Ethan's attention. Slowly, he turned. "And who exactly does he think he is?" Before the assistant could answer, a second voice filled the room. Deep, measured, uninvited. "The kind of man who built empires before you learned how to sign your name." The air shifted instantly. Clara stiffened. Ethan's expression hardened as he turned toward the doorway. And that's when he saw him, Sebastian Varelli. Sebastian didn't enter like a guest. He walked in, like the space already belonged to him. Every step carried quiet authority. No rush, no need to announce himself further. Because his presence did it for him. Behind him, two executives from the board trailed in, men who, just yesterday, had been nodding along to Ethan's every word. Now, they looked cautious, respectful, careful. Ethan straightened. "I don't recall inviting you." Sebastian's gaze swept across the office once, taking in everything. The glass walls, the skyline, Clara, and finally, "Ethan, you didn't," Sebastian replied calmly. "But then again, this conversation was never about your permission." Silence, heavy, immediate. Clara shifted slightly, attempting to regain control of the moment. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. If you'd like to schedule." Sebastian raised a hand. She stopped speaking instantly, not because he forced her, but because something in his presence made interruption feel inappropriate. He stepped closer to Ethan, not aggressive, just certain. "You made a decision yesterday," Sebastian said. "A very public one." Ethan held his ground, "And I'd make it again." A pause. Then, Sebastian's expression changed. Not anger, not approval, something far more dangerous. Clarity. "You discarded her," he said quietly. Ethan's jaw tightened. "If you're here to discuss my personal affairs, you can leave." Sebastian didn't move. Instead, his next words landed like a controlled detonation. "She was never yours to discard." The room froze. Even the air felt different. Ethan let out a short, humorless breath. "I don't know what story you've been told, but Zariah," Sebastian repeated, cutting him off, not loudly, but with precision, "was the foundation you stood on." That hit, not visibly, but enough. Clara stepped forward, her voice sharper now. "This is completely inappropriate." Sebastian turned his head slightly, just a glance, and she stopped again. Silence returned. Then, he looked back at Ethan. "You thought you built everything alone," Sebastian continued. "That everything you touched turned valuable because of you. A step closer. You were wrong." Ethan's composure flickered, only for a second, but it was there. Sebastian's voice dropped slightly, not softer, but heavier. "You threw her away like she was nothing." A brief pause. "And in less than a day, you'll understand exactly what you lost." No raised voice, no dramatic movement, just certainty, the kind that didn't need volume to be heard. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me?" Sebastian almost smiled. "No." A beat. "I'm correcting you." The tension in the room became unbearable. Even the board members shifted uneasily. Because this wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't business. This was something far more personal and far more consequential. Sebastian adjusted his sleeve calmly, then delivered the final line, the one that would echo long after he left. You were never meant to be built. His gaze sharpened. You were the one being carried. And just like that, he turned, walking out the same way he came in, unstoppable, unchallenged, leaving behind a silence that felt louder than any confrontation. Ethan didn't move, didn't speak, but, for the first time since the courtroom, something didn't feel like control anymore. Something felt uncertain. He threw her away like she was nothing. Less than 24 hours later, the most powerful man in the room came to claim her value. Have you ever stood beside someone while they climbed higher and higher, only for them to look back and act like you were never there? This is what happens when someone confuses access with worth. When they believe proximity to greatness makes them the source of it. Stay till the end. Because when the truth surfaces, it won't just shake him, it will dismantle everything he thought he had secured. Before we go further, tap like, drop a comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be heard. And you don't want to miss what's coming next. Long before courtrooms, contracts, and quiet betrayals, Zariah Cole learned what it meant to stand without being seen. Atlanta didn't raise her gently. It shaped her with pressure, expectation, and a kind of quiet resilience that most people never notice until it's too late. She grew up on the southwest side of the city, where the streets carried stories, where every block held both struggle and pride, and where survival wasn't loud. It was disciplined. Her mother, Lorraine Cole, didn't believe in excuses. She believed in results. You don't wait for doors to open, Lorraine would say, her voice firm but never harsh. You learn how to build one. Those words weren't motivational. They were instruction. Zariah learned early that love didn't always come wrapped in softness. Sometimes it came in structure, in expectation, in being told to do better even when you were already trying your hardest. Their home wasn't large, but it was intentional. Every object had a place. Every decision had purpose. There was no room for waste, not time, not effort, not potential. And while other kids her age chased distractions, Zariah paid attention. She watched how her mother stretched $1 into stability, how she carried herself with dignity even when life pressed hard against her, how she never asked for acknowledgement, but earned respect anyway. That distinction stayed with Zariah. Respect wasn't given, it was built. School became her proving ground, not because she needed validation, but because she understood something most people didn't grasp until much later. Being underestimated was an advantage. If you knew how to use it, teachers noticed her, not for noise, not for attention, but for precision. Zariah didn't speak unless she had something worth saying, and when she did, people listened. There was a clarity in her thinking that felt older than her age, a steadiness, a quiet command. While others sought recognition, Zariah focused on understanding systems, how people moved, how decisions were made, how influence worked in subtle ways. She wasn't trying to stand out. She was learning how to position herself, and that difference? It would define everything later. At home, responsibility came naturally. She didn't need to be told twice. Cooking, cleaning, helping her younger cousins when they stayed over, not as chores, but as preparation. Because in her world, independence wasn't optional. It was expected. Still, there were moments, small, almost invisible, where the weight showed. Late nights, at the kitchen table, homework spread out, a single lamp lighting the room, her mother asleep in the next room after another long shift. Zariah would pause sometimes, just for a second, not out of exhaustion, but reflection, because even then, she understood something most people avoid confronting. No one was coming to change her life for her. And strangely, that realization didn't discourage her. It focused her. Atlanta didn't give her comfort. It gave her awareness. It taught her how to read people without asking questions, how to stay composed when emotions threatened to rise, how to build strength without needing recognition for it, and most importantly, it taught her how to carry others without letting it show. Because in her world, strength wasn't loud. It was consistent. It was reliable. It was the ability to keep going without needing applause. That was the version of Zariah no one in that courtroom understood. Not Ethan, not Clara, not the audience that watched her sign away a life they assumed she depended on. They saw silence. They mistook it for weakness. But silence, in Zariah's world, was control. The first place Zariah ever understood power wasn't a boardroom. It was a beauty supply store. Small, busy, always alive with conversation. The kind of place where women didn't just shop, they connected, shared, advised, corrected, uplifted. It belonged to her aunt, Denise, a woman who ran her business with precision and presence. People don't just come here for products, Denise told her one afternoon, handing her a box to restock shelves. They come here to feel seen. Zariah didn't respond immediately. She observed. That was always her first instinct. Customers came in with different energies. Some confident, some uncertain, some carrying stories they didn't say out loud. And Denise? She met every one of them exactly where they were. Recommending the right product wasn't enough. She understood tone, timing, trust. Watch closely, Denise added. So, Zariah did. She watched how conversations turned into relationships, how a simple recommendation turned into loyalty, how consistency built something deeper than profit, and slowly, she became part of it. At first, it was small tasks, stocking, cleaning, running the register, but Zariah didn't treat any of it like something minor. She approached everything with intention, because she understood, instinctively, that details create outcomes. It didn't take long before customers began noticing her. She's sharp, one woman remarked quietly to Denise. Zariah heard it, but didn't react. Praise wasn't her focus. Understanding was. Soon, she started helping customers directly, not just answering questions, but reading them. There was a difference between what people asked for and what they actually needed. Zariah saw that gap, and she filled it. You don't sell to people, Denise told her one evening as they closed up shop. You serve them. That's how you build something that lasts. Zariah nodded, but, internally, she went further. She realized something deeper. Value wasn't about being visible. It was about being necessary. That store became her first classroom in human behavior. She learned how confidence could be influenced, how identity could shift with the right encouragement, how people returned, not just because of what they bought, but because of how they felt. And most importantly, she learned how to create that feeling. That skill would later build something far bigger than either of them imagined. But back then, it was simple, quiet, foundational, no audience, no recognition, just a young girl learning how to create impact without needing credit for it. Zariah was never raised in isolation. She was surrounded by strength, by expectation, by women who didn't wait for validation to know their worth. Her mother, Lorraine, her aunt, Denise, neighbors who functioned like extended family. Each of them carried a presence that didn't need to be announced. They were the kind of women who handled problems directly, who didn't romanticize struggle, but respected what it taught them. And Zariah? She absorbed all of it. Not just their words, but their patterns, how they spoke, how they moved, how they held themselves in rooms that weren't designed for them. There were no long lectures, no dramatic lessons, just consistent examples. You don't shrink to make anyone comfortable, Lorraine said once, adjusting her jacket before heading to work. Denise added her own version in the store. Never let someone confuse your silence for lack of awareness. Different phrasing, same message. Zariah internalized both. From them, she learned that strength wasn't aggression. It was clarity. It was knowing who you were, without needing others to confirm it. And yet, none of these women were harsh. They laughed. They supported each other. They celebrated small wins like they mattered. Because they did. That balance shaped Zariah more than anything. She didn't grow up chasing approval. She grew up understanding value. Her value, other people's value, and the difference between the two, because, while many people mistake presence for importance, Zariah learned to recognize substance. And that awareness? It would later expose everything Ethan misunderstood about her. By the time Zariah reached her late teens, it was already clear. She didn't follow energy. She directed it, not loudly, not forcefully, but effectively. Group projects at school always shifted when she was involved. Not because she demanded control, but because people trusted her decisions. even when they didn't fully understand them yet. She had a way of seeing outcomes before they happened, of identifying weak points before they became problems, and more importantly, she knew how to manage people without making them feel managed. That was her difference. Anyone could give instructions, but Zariah, she created alignment. "You always know what to say," one classmate told her once. She shook her head slightly. "No," she replied calmly. "I just listen first." And that was the truth. Her emotional intelligence wasn't accidental. It was built from years of observation, from understanding tone, intention, hesitation, from reading what wasn't spoken. That ability made her effective in ways others couldn't explain. Teachers respected her. Peers relied on her. But Zariah never leaned into that attention, because for her, leadership wasn't about being seen. It was about being trusted, and trust was built quietly, consistently, without performance. That same mindset followed her into every space she entered, including the one that would change everything. Chicago moved differently, faster, sharper, less forgiving. Zariah felt it the moment she stepped into the venue. The networking event wasn't about introductions. It was about positioning, investors, entrepreneurs, people measuring each other in real time. And in the middle of it, Zariah stood, composed as always, observing before engaging. Because rooms like this weren't about who spoke first. They were about who understood the room best. That's when she noticed him, Ethan Cole, younger than most in the room, but louder in presence, not in volume. In ambition, he moved quickly from one conversation to another, selling ideas, presenting visions, building connections. But something about it felt unfinished, polished on the surface, unstable underneath. Zariah watched, not judging, just analyzing. And then, their paths crossed. "First time here?" Ethan asked, offering a confident smile. Zariah met his gaze calmly. "No." A brief pause. He wasn't expecting that answer. "I would have remembered you. Then you weren't paying attention." That caught him, not offensively, but enough to shift his approach. Most people tried to impress him. Zariah didn't try at all. And that difference pulled him in immediately. Ethan adjusted slightly, recalibrating. "All right," he said, a hint of curiosity replacing confidence. "Then tell me what I missed." Zariah tilted her head just enough to signal thought, not hesitation. "You're moving too fast," she said. He blinked. "Excuse me?" "You're trying to secure interest before you've established trust." Direct, unfiltered, accurate. Ethan studied her. Most people praised his approach. She dissected it. "You don't know anything about me," he said carefully. "I don't need to," Zariah replied. "You're focused on being impressive. That works short term. But long term? People invest in stability." Silence stretched between them. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged. Ethan exhaled slowly. "No one's ever said that to me before." Zariah's response was simple. "That's the problem." And just like that, something shifted. Not romantic. Not yet. But undeniable. Respect. Interest. Challenge. The kind of connection that doesn't rely on attraction alone, but on alignment. Ethan smiled slightly. "Then maybe you should stay close," he said. Zariah didn't smile back. "I don't stay close to potential," she said. "I stay close to direction." That line stayed with him, long after the conversation ended. Later that evening, the crowd thinned. The noise softened, and Ethan found her again, not by accident. "I've been thinking about what you said," he admitted. Zariah didn't respond immediately. She waited, giving space, letting him continue. "I've been trying to prove something," Ethan said, his tone quieter now. "To people who didn't believe in me." There it was, the truth beneath the ambition. Zariah nodded slightly. "That's why you move the way you do," she said. Not a question, a confirmation. Ethan let out a breath. Yeah, for the first time that night. He wasn't performing. He was honest, and Zariah recognized it instantly. But she didn't soften. She clarified. "Proving people wrong isn't a strategy," she said. "It's a reaction." Ethan looked at her. Really looked this time. "Then what is a strategy?" Zariah's answer came without hesitation. "Building something so solid that it doesn't require validation. That moment defined everything that came after, because Ethan saw something in her he didn't have: clarity, direction, control. And Zariah, she saw something in him too: potential, but more importantly, instability. And yet, she didn't walk away. Not because she needed him, but because she understood something he didn't yet grasp. With the right structure, potential could become power. Chicago didn't hand Ethan Cole opportunity, it tested him. Every meeting felt like a proving ground. Every conversation came with quiet judgment. Investors listened, but not fully. Partners nodded, but didn't commit. Potential was there, but potential doesn't build empires. Structure does, and that was the part Ethan didn't fully understand, until Zariah stepped in. It started small, not as a takeover, not even as guidance he openly asked for, just adjustments. Late nights became routine, not glamorous strategy sessions, but long, focused hours at a small dining table in Zariah's apartment. Papers spread out, financial models open on her laptop, notes written with precision, not guesswork. Ethan paced often, talking fast, thinking faster. "They're interested," he said one night, running a hand through his hair. "I can feel it. I just need to push harder." Zariah didn't look up immediately. She finished typing. Then, "You don't push harder," she said calmly. "You refine." Ethan stopped pacing. "What does that even mean?" Zariah turned the laptop slightly toward him. "You're selling vision," she explained, "but you're not answering risk." He frowned. "I told them the upside." "Everyone talks about upside," she replied. "That's not what closes deals." Silence. Ethan leaned in. "So what does?" Zariah tapped the screen. "Clarity, predictability, proof." She walked him through it. Not like a lecture, like a blueprint. You need to show them where the business stabilizes, what happens when growth slows, how you protect their money, not just multiply it. Ethan listened, really listened, because for the first time, someone wasn't reacting to his ambition. They were strengthening it. That night changed his approach. The next pitch felt different, not louder, sharper, more controlled, and for the first time, someone said yes, not a full investment, but enough, a starting point. Ethan came back energized. "They bought in," he said, barely containing the excitement. Zariah nodded once. Good. That was it. No celebration, no moment of acknowledgement, just forward movement. Because, to her, that wasn't success. It was step one. And over time, those nights continued, each one building something stronger than the last. She refined his language, adjusted his projections, challenged his assumptions, and quietly, she became the structure behind his momentum. The first real breakthrough didn't come from a meeting. It came from a decision Zariah made alone. Ethan didn't know how close everything was to collapsing. He saw progress, movement, momentum, but he didn't see the gaps, the unpaid invoices, the shortfalls hidden behind optimistic projections. Zariah saw all of it, because she looked deeper. And one night, after reviewing the numbers for the third time, she made a choice, not emotional, not impulsive, calculated. She opened her personal account, years of savings, carefully built, disciplined, untouched, unless necessary. And in her mind, this qualified as necessary, not because she believed in the dream, but because she understood the structure needed to support it. The transfer wasn't dramatic. No hesitation, no second guessing, just action. The next morning, Ethan noticed. "Where did this come from?" he asked, staring at the updated figures. Zariah didn't shift. "I covered the gap," she said simply. Ethan blinked. "You? What?" "You needed liquidity to maintain operations," she explained. "Now you have it." He stared at her. "Processing. You didn't have to do that." Zariah met his gaze. "Yes, I did." A pause. "Why?" he asked. Her answer didn't carry emotion. It carried logic. "Because if the foundation breaks, nothing else matters." Ethan exhaled slowly. "You trust this that much?" Zariah didn't respond immediately. Then, "I trust what it can become," she said. That distinction mattered, but Ethan didn't fully grasp it. Not yet. To him, it felt like belief, support, loyalty. To Zariah, it was alignment. She didn't invest in him blindly. She invested in what she knew she could help build. But that difference was never acknowledged. Not then, not later. Because from that point forward, her contribution became invisible. Not intentionally, but gradually. As the business grew, so did the perception that Ethan had done it alone. And Zariah? She didn't correct it. Not once. Success didn't arrive all at once. It built itself in layers. And in every layer, Zariah was present. Not in front, not in title, but in impact. Meetings became smoother. Decisions became sharper. Risks became calculated instead of reactive. Ethan evolved, not just as a businessman, but as a presence, confident, controlled, respected, and everyone noticed the change. What they didn't notice was where it came from. "You've leveled up," one investor told him after a presentation. Ethan smiled. "Experience," he replied. Zariah, standing off to the side, said nothing. Because correcting that narrative wasn't her priority. The outcome was, behind closed doors, her influence was clear. "You're agreeing too quickly," she told him, after one negotiation. "They're offering capital," Ethan replied. "That's the goal." "Not at that cost," she said. "You're giving up too much control." Ethan hesitated. "They'll walk if I push back." Zariah held his gaze. "Then they're not the right partners." That moment tested him, but he listened. He pushed back, and they didn't walk. They adjusted. That became the pattern. Ethan made moves. Zariah refined them. He opened doors. She made sure what entered those doors didn't destabilize everything. And over time, the business transformed from uncertain beginnings to a company people took seriously, the Cole Group, a name that began to carry weight. Recognition followed. Media mentions, invitations, expansion opportunities. Ethan stepped into every room with growing confidence. And Zariah? She remained where she had always been. Present, steady, unseen by most, but essential. Because what people called Ethan's instinct was often Zariah's foresight. What they praised as his leadership was shaped by her clarity, and what they believed was his success alone was built on decisions she made quietly, without expectation, without demand, without recognition. CTA EE2, mid-early engagement. Be honest. Could you build someone like this and not expect loyalty in return? Comment below. The wedding wasn't extravagant, but it was intentional. Zariah didn't care for display. Ethan didn't insist on it. At that stage, they still aligned more than they differed. But alignment doesn't guarantee permanence. Because, after the vows, real life begins to reveal what love doesn't address. Zariah carried her upbringing into the marriage. Structure, discipline, a clear understanding of value beyond appearance. Ethan carried something different. Aspiration, recognition, a growing attachment to what success looked like from the outside. At first, it blended well. Zariah grounded him. Ethan elevated their exposure. But over time, the differences became clearer. Subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. Zariah preferred quiet evenings, focused conversations, intentional decisions. Ethan began attending more events, networking dinners, spaces where perception mattered as much as performance. "You should come with me," he suggested one evening. Zariah looked up from her work. "For what?" "To be seen," he said. She studied him for a moment. "I don't need to be seen," she replied. "I need to be effective." That response didn't sit the same way it once would have, not because it was wrong, but because Ethan's priorities were shifting, and slowly. That shift created distance. It didn't happen through arguments. There were no explosive moments, no dramatic confrontations, just space, gradual, quiet, increasing. Conversations became shorter, not cold, just less present. Zariah noticed first Because she always noticed. "You're distracted," she said one night. Ethan glanced up briefly. "Just work." Zariah nodded. But she knew better. Because she understood something most people avoid admitting. Distance isn't created by busyness. It's created by priority. And slowly, she was no longer his. He still came home, still spoke, still moved through their shared life. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Attention, focus, energy, redirected, not completely, but enough. And the most telling part? Zariah didn't chase it. Didn't question him repeatedly. Didn't demand explanations. Because she had learned, long ago, if something requires chasing to stay, it's already leaving. Success changes people. Not always immediately, but inevitably. The Cole Group grew. Bigger deals, bigger rooms, more influence, and with that came something Ethan hadn't fully experienced before: recognition. Not quiet respect, visible status, the kind that gets noticed when you walk in, the kind that changes how people speak to you, look at you, position themselves around you. At first, he handled it well, grateful, focused, still grounded, but over time, that recognition began to attach itself to his identity, not just something he had, something he was. And that shift was subtle, but dangerous. "You don't understand how this works at this level," he told Zariah during one discussion, not aggressively, but dismissively. Zariah didn't react immediately. She simply looked at him, and in that moment, she saw it clearly, the change, not in his success, but in his perception of it. Because, for the first time, Ethan wasn't just building something, he was becoming someone who believed he no longer needed what helped him build it. Zariah didn't argue, didn't correct him, because she understood something he didn't. When people start separating themselves from their foundation, they don't realize what they're risking until it's gone, and by the time they recognize it, it's usually too late. Clara Voss didn't arrive loudly. She didn't need to. By the time she reappeared in Ethan Cole's world, she understood exactly how to position herself. Visible enough to be noticed, refined enough to be accepted, and distant enough to feel exclusive. The first time Zariah saw her again wasn't at home, it was at an industry event. One of the larger ones, the kind where presence mattered as much as performance. Zariah hadn't planned to attend, but Ethan had insisted. "It's important," he said. "You should be there." So she went, not to be seen, but to observe. The room carried its usual rhythm: measured conversations, strategic introductions, controlled laughter, people evaluating each other without appearing to. And then Clara stepped in. Everything about her was intentional: her posture, her timing, even the way she paused, just long enough at the entrance to let the room register her presence. Zariah noticed immediately, not because Clara demanded attention, but because she understood attention. Clara moved through the room with ease, greeting familiar faces, exchanging brief but meaningful interactions. She didn't overextend herself. She didn't linger. She created the impression of access, without full availability. That was her advantage. Zariah watched quietly, analyzing, and then she saw it. Ethan, across the room, already engaged in conversation with Clara, not formally, not distantly, comfortably, too comfortably. Clara leaned slightly toward him, her expression open, her tone soft enough to suggest familiarity without revealing history. Ethan responded with something Zariah hadn't seen in a while: effort, not forced, but intentional, engaged, present. Zariah didn't move closer. She didn't interrupt, because she understood something deeper than surface interaction. This wasn't about Clara entering the room. This was about what she represented. Clara wasn't just a person. She was alignment with a world Ethan was growing into: status, visibility, validation from spaces Zariah never needed to impress. And, slowly, that difference began to matter. Later that evening, Ethan approached Zariah. "You met Clara, right?" he asked. Zariah met his gaze evenly. "I've seen her." Ethan nodded. "She's well connected, could be valuable." Zariah didn't respond immediately. Because she wasn't evaluating Clara's connections. She was evaluating Ethan. What kind of value? She asked calmly. Ethan paused. Then, positioning. Access. She understands this level. Zariah held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, noted. That was all, no accusation, no assumption. But internally, she had already identified the shift. Clara wasn't the threat. What Ethan projected onto her was, it didn't change overnight. Nothing that matters ever does. At first, it was subtle, almost easy to dismiss. Ethan mentioned Clara more frequently, but always within context. She introduced me to someone. She's hosting a private dinner. She understands how these investors think. Each statement sounded reasonable, strategic, even beneficial. And Zariah? She listened, without interruption, because nothing he said was technically wrong, but something underneath it was shifting. Time allocation changed first. More evenings out, more last-minute engagements, more necessary appearances. Zariah didn't question it, not because she didn't notice, but because she was observing patterns, and patterns always reveal truth. Then came the difference in energy. When Ethan spoke about business with Zariah, it became shorter, more surface level, less detailed. But when Clara's name came up, there was expansion, explanation, engagement. That contrast mattered. You've been busy, Zariah said one evening as Ethan walked in later than usual. Ethan loosened his tie. It's part of the growth. Zariah nodded. Of course. No tension, no conflict. But something was being confirmed. Days passed, then weeks, and gradually, the emotional space between them widened, not dramatically, but consistently. Ethan still functioned within the marriage, still present physically, but mentally, his focus had shifted toward environments that reinforced his rising status, toward people who reflected that identity back to him, and Clara fit that reflection perfectly. One evening, Zariah watched him from across the room as he took a call. His tone changed, lighter, more engaged. Yeah, I'll be there, he said. Send me the details. He ended the call. Zariah didn't ask who it was. She didn't need to, because she had already learned something critical. When attention redirects, explanation becomes optional. And that's when you understand. It's no longer about circumstance. It's about choice. Zariah didn't confront Ethan, not because she was unaware, but because she was precise. Confrontation requires clarity, and Zariah never moved without it. She watched, listened, not just to words, but to patterns, consistency, energy, intent. The indicators were all there, not in dramatic moments, but in small repeated signals, delayed responses, reduced engagement, a shift in how decisions were communicated rather than discussed. Zariah recognized all of it, but she didn't react emotionally because she had learned something early in life. Reaction gives away position. Observation builds understanding, and understanding gives control. So she stayed still. Externally, internally, she was calculating, not in a strategic, manipulative way, but in alignment. What had changed? Why had it changed? And more importantly, what did it mean moving forward? One night, she sat across from Ethan at dinner. Silence filled the space between them. Not uncomfortable, just present. You're different, she said finally. Ethan looked up briefly. How? Zariah held his gaze. You've started prioritizing perception over structure. He frowned slightly. That's not true. Zariah didn't argue, didn't push. She simply nodded. All right. That response unsettled him more than disagreement would have, because there was no resistance, no effort to convince, just acknowledgement. And that kind of calm feels like distance. Zariah wasn't withdrawing. She was adjusting, understanding that something had shifted, and allowing it to reveal itself fully, because she knew something Ethan didn't. People always show you who they are, not when you force them to, but when you stop interfering. The conversation didn't happen in anger. There were no raised voices, no emotional buildup, just a quiet evening, and a decision that had already been made. Ethan stood near the window, looking out at the city. Zariah sat across the room, calm, composed, aware. "I've been thinking," Ethan said finally. Zariah didn't respond immediately. She waited, letting him continue. "This isn't working." The words were simple, but deliberate. Zariah studied him, not for emotion, for certainty. "How long have you felt that way?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. "Then, a while." Zariah nodded once. "That explains the distance." Ethan shifted slightly. "I didn't want it to get to this point." Zariah tilted her head just enough to acknowledge the statement. But it did. Silence followed. Not heavy, just final. Ethan turned toward her. "I think we should end this." Zariah didn't react. Not outwardly. No shock. No visible pain. Because she had already processed the possibility long before he spoke it. "What does end look like to you?" she asked. Ethan exhaled. "Divorce." The word settled between them. Clear, unavoidable. Zariah held his gaze, then nodded. Understood. That response caught him off guard. "You're not going to say anything else?" Zariah remained steady. "You've already decided." A pause. "There's nothing to negotiate." That was the difference between them. Ethan approached the moment as a conclusion. Zariah approached it as confirmation, because, emotionally, she had already stepped back when the shift began. Ethan moved slightly closer, not out of connection, but discomfort. "I'm not happy anymore," he said. The statement hung in the air, common, expected, but incomplete. Zariah didn't interrupt. She let it stand, because she understood something most people avoid admitting. Happiness is often used as justification, when the real reason is something harder to explain. "What does that mean?" she asked calmly. Ethan looked at her. Frustration flickered briefly. "It means, this isn't fulfilling for me anymore." Zariah nodded. "Because," he hesitated, searching for something more concrete. But the truth wasn't simple. It wasn't one moment. It was accumulation, shift, redirection. "I've grown," he said finally. Zariah considered that, then responded, "So have I." That landed, because growth wasn't the issue. Alignment was. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "I just want something different." Zariah's expression didn't change. "You already have it," she said. Not accusatory, just factual. Ethan didn't respond, because they both knew what she meant. Clara, the environments, the identity he was stepping into. Zariah didn't name it. She didn't need to. Silence confirmed everything. There was no argument, no emotional collapse, no attempt to repair what had already separated. Zariah stood, not abruptly, not slowly, just decisively. "When do you want to proceed?" she asked. Ethan blinked. "You're really okay with this?" Zariah looked at him. Not cold, not distant, clear. "I don't hold on to things that no longer align." That answer carried weight, because it wasn't defensive. It was resolved. Ethan exhaled. "We can start the paperwork this week." Zariah nodded. "Fine." And just like that, the conversation ended. No dramatic exit, no lingering tension, just conclusion. Over the following days, everything moved efficiently. Lawyers, documents, arrangements. Zariah handled her side with the same precision she applied to everything else. No delays, no complications, no emotional interference. And when the final papers were placed in front of her, she didn't hesitate, because by then, the relationship wasn't ending. It had already ended. This was just the formal acknowledgement, the signature, the closure. And when she signed, it wasn't loss, it was release. A quiet transition from something she had built to something she would no longer carry. Zariah didn't leave Chicago immediately after the divorce. She stayed, not because she was uncertain, but because she didn't move without intention. The apartment felt different now, not empty, just quieter, cleaner, as if something unnecessary had finally been removed. No tension, no emotional residue, just space. And Zariah understood something clearly. Space isn't loss, it's opportunity. That morning, she sat near the window, reviewing documents on her laptop, personal restructuring, financial realignment, decisions that had nothing to do with Ethan anymore. Her focus was uninterrupted until her phone rang. Unknown number. Zariah let it ring once, twice, then answered, Zariah Cole. A brief pause. Then, good. I prefer clarity. The voice was familiar, not personally, but in presence, controlled, measured, certain. Zariah didn't ask who it was. She already knew. Sebastian Varelli. I assume you don't call without purpose, she said calmly. A faint shift on the other end. Not surprise. Recognition. Correct, Sebastian replied. I don't engage without reason. Zariah closed her laptop slowly. Then say what you need to say. No hesitation, no curiosity disguised as politeness, just directness. Sebastian appreciated that. I'd like to meet, he said. Zariah didn't respond immediately, because she wasn't evaluating the invitation. She was evaluating the intent behind it. Why? She asked. A pause. Then, because you've been mispositioned, Sebastian said. And I don't ignore assets when I recognize them. The word asset didn't offend her, because he wasn't reducing her. He was identifying value. Still, Zariah didn't accept immediately. Time and place, she said finally. Not agreement, but openness. Sebastian gave both. A private location, discreet, intentional. Tomorrow, he added. Zariah ended the call without confirmation, not out of dismissal, but because she had already decided. The next evening, Zariah arrived exactly on time. The setting matched the tone of the invitation. Private, refined, no excess, just precision. Sebastian was already there, seated, waiting, not impatient, not distracted, present. Zariah approached without hesitation. No introduction, no performance, just acknowledgement. You're punctual, he said. Zariah took her seat. I don't waste time. A slight pause. Then, neither spoke for a moment, not because there was nothing to say, but because both understood silence and what it reveals. Sebastian studied her, not superficially, not with curiosity, with assessment. You don't look like someone who just walked away from everything, he said. Zariah met his gaze. I didn't walk away from everything, she replied. Just what no longer aligned. That answer settled between them. Not dramatic, but precise. Sebastian leaned back slightly. Good. One word. But it carried approval. Not personal. Strategic. Zariah didn't ask how he knew her, because she already understood the level he operated on. Information wasn't requested. It was acquired. Still. She let him speak. Atlanta, Sebastian began. Southwest Side. Raised by Lorraine Cole. Structured environment. No wasted movement. Zariah didn't react. Not visibly, but internally. She noted something important. Accuracy. You worked in your aunt's beauty supply store, he continued. Learned customer behavior. Before you ever stepped into business strategy. Zariah remained still. You met Ethan Cole in Chicago, Sebastian added. Corrected his approach before he even realized it needed correction. A pause. You invested your own capital when his structure couldn't support growth. Another pause, longer this time. And you never once corrected the narrative that he built it alone. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was acknowledgement, because everything he said was true. Zariah leaned back slightly. You've done your research, she said. Sebastian's response was immediate. I don't research, he replied. I verify. That distinction mattered, because it revealed something deeper. He wasn't gathering information for curiosity. He was confirming value. You understand something most people don't, he continued. Value doesn't need visibility to exist. Zariah's expression remained steady, but visibility determines who benefits from it. That landed, because it addressed the reality she had lived. Quiet contribution, public misattribution, and now, correction. You didn't call me here to repeat what I already know, Zariah said. Sebastian nodded once. Correct. A brief pause. Then, I called you because I recognize what you are. Zoraya didn't respond. She let him define it. Rare. The word wasn't exaggerated. It was measured, intentional, and delivered without hesitation. Zoraya folded her hands lightly on the table. What exactly are you proposing? She asked. Direct, focused. Sebastian didn't rush his answer, because nothing about him moved impulsively. Alignment, he said. Zoraya tilted her head slightly. Define it. Sebastian leaned forward just enough to signal engagement. You understand structure, influence, and restraint, he explained. 3 things. Most people at this level never master. Zoraya listened. You don't seek attention, he continued, which means you can control environments without being controlled by them. A pause. That makes you valuable. Zoraya held his gaze. Value alone doesn't create alignment, she said. Sebastian nodded. Correct. Another pause. Then, I don't pursue what's available, he said calmly. Zoraya remained still. I recognize what's rare. The statement didn't feel like a compliment. It felt like selection, and that difference mattered. Zoraya considered it. Not emotionally, strategically. You're not offering opportunity, she said. Sebastian's expression didn't change. No, he replied. I'm offering position. That clarified everything. Because opportunity is temporary. Position is sustained. What happens if I decline? Zoraya asked. Sebastian leaned back. Then nothing changes, he said. You continue operating at a level that doesn't reflect your actual value. No pressure, no persuasion, just reality. Zoraya respected that, because it meant his interest wasn't based on need. It was based on recognition. And recognition, at that level, is never accidental. If you've ever been underestimated, type I know my worth in the comments. Zoraya didn't accept immediately, not because she doubted Sebastian, but because she respected process, and Sebastian didn't rush her. That was the first difference. No pressure, no expectation, no attempt to accelerate what hadn't fully formed. Instead, he adjusted. Meetings became conversations, not frequent, but intentional. Each one structured, focused, productive. He introduced her to environments that reflected her level, but never forced her to perform within them. You don't need to prove anything here, he said during one private meeting. Zoraya glanced at him briefly. I never did, she replied. Sebastian nodded. Exactly. That understanding created something rare. Comfort without dependency, respect without imbalance, and slowly, Zoraya began to recalibrate, not emotionally, internally, reclaiming space she had given away without realizing it. With Sebastian, there was no need to shrink, no need to overextend, no need to explain her value, because it had already been recognized and protected. That protection wasn't loud, it wasn't possessive, it was structural. He positioned her correctly, ensured she wasn't overlooked, not by demanding attention, but by establishing presence, and in doing so, he created an environment where Zoraya could exist fully, without compromise. For the first time in a long time, Zoraya focused entirely on herself, not in isolation, but in alignment. She revisited ideas she had set aside, concepts she never pursued because they didn't fit within Ethan's trajectory. Now, they did, and more importantly, they made sense. Her days shifted, not reactive, structured, intentional. She built quietly, as she always had, but this time, the outcome would carry her name, not someone else's. Sebastian didn't interfere. He observed, supported when necessary, but never inserted himself where he wasn't needed. That restraint mattered, because it allowed Zoraya to rebuild without influence, to define her direction without external pressure. And as she did, something became clear. She hadn't lost anything. She had been misaligned, and now, she was correcting it, piece by piece, decision by decision, without noise, without announcement, just progress. What developed between them wasn't immediate. It wasn't driven by emotion. It wasn't even labeled, and that's what made it different. Their connection existed in understanding, in presence, in shared perspective, not in declarations. There were moments, small, subtle, meaningful, a glance that lasted slightly longer than necessary, a conversation that extended beyond business without intention, a silence that didn't need to be filled. But neither of them moved to define it, because neither of them needed to. One evening, after a long discussion, Zariah stood near the window of Sebastian's office. The city stretched out below, alive, constant, unpredictable. "You're still observing," Sebastian said from behind her. Zariah didn't turn. "I always am." A pause. Then, "And you?" she asked. Sebastian's response came without hesitation. "I don't observe," he said. "I decide." Zariah turned slightly. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, there was something unspoken, not tension, not uncertainty, recognition of timing, of alignment, of something that didn't need to be rushed, because it wasn't fragile, it was controlled. And when something is built with that level of precision, it doesn't need urgency, it becomes inevitable. Ethan Cole wasn't looking for answers. That was the truth. By the time his life began to stabilize again, at least on the surface, he had already convinced himself that the past was settled. The divorce was finalized. Zariah was gone. And whatever role she had once played in his life had been closed, or so he believed. The Cole Group continued to operate, but something had changed beneath the surface. Deals felt harder to secure. Negotiations required more effort. Decisions, once clear, now carried uncertainty. At first, Ethan blamed the market, then timing, then external pressure. But, slowly, a different thought began to form, one he didn't want to acknowledge. Something was missing, not visibly, not in numbers, but in stability, and that absence didn't have a name he was ready to say out loud. That morning, he sat in his office, reviewing a report one of his senior analysts had prepared. Detailed, thorough, but something about it felt incomplete. "You missed something," Ethan said, flipping a page. The analyst hesitated. "I covered everything we discussed." Ethan frowned slightly. "No," he said. "There's a gap." Silence followed, because no one in the room could identify what he meant. And that frustrated him more than the mistake itself. "Fix it," he said, closing the file. The meeting ended quickly. Ethan remained seated, still, thinking, because for the first time since the divorce, he felt something unfamiliar. Disorientation, not emotional, structural, like a system that used to function seamlessly, now requiring effort just to maintain itself. His phone buzzed, a message, from an unfamiliar number. He almost ignored it, almost, but something made him open it. A single line. "You should look deeper into what you walked away from." No name, no explanation, just that. Ethan stared at the screen, then dismissed it, assuming it was irrelevant, until a second message arrived. An attachment, a file. He hesitated for a moment, then opened it. At first, it looked like a standard document, medical, confidential, time-stamped. Ethan's eyes scanned the page quickly, then slowed, then stopped, because the name at the top was one he hadn't expected to see again in that context. Zariah Cole, below it. Two additional names, unfamiliar, but connected. Ethan leaned forward, reading more carefully now. His expression didn't change immediately, but something behind his eyes did. The dates, the timeline, the details, all aligned, too precisely to ignore. Ethan sat back slowly. The room suddenly felt different, smaller, quieter, because what he was looking at didn't just introduce new information, it corrected everything he thought he knew. Zariah hadn't just left. She had carried something with her, something he had never asked about, never noticed, never even considered. And now, it was in front of him, undeniable, unavoidable. 2 children. Twins. His children. Ethan didn't react immediately, not outwardly, because his mind was already moving, reconstructing, calculating, revisiting moments he had dismissed at the time. Zariah's distance toward the end of the marriage, her quiet withdrawal, her refusal to engage emotionally when he began shifting away. At the time, he interpreted it as detachment. Now, he saw something else. Protection. Ethan stood abruptly, grabbing the file, reading it again, slower this time, more carefully. The dates aligned with a period he remembered clearly: late nights, missed conversations, his increasing focus on expansion. And Clara, Zariah had been there, present, still functioning within the marriage, still supporting the structure he depended on, while carrying something far greater, alone. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. But it did. That was the problem. Everything made sense. He just hadn't been paying attention. A third message arrived. This time, a location, no explanation, just an address. Ethan didn't hesitate. Not this time, because now, it wasn't about curiosity. It was about confirmation. The building was quiet, private, deliberate. Ethan stepped inside, his usual confidence replaced with something unfamiliar. Urgency. The receptionist didn't stop him, didn't question him, just directed him, as if his arrival had already been anticipated. That unsettled him. He reached the designated floor, walked down the hallway, then stopped, because, through the glass panel ahead, he saw them. 2 children, seated, engaged in conversation, identical in structure, different in expression. One more observant, the other more expressive. Ethan didn't move, couldn't, because, in that moment, recognition hit without permission. Not from the file, not from logic. From instinct. They were his. There was no question, no doubt, no uncertainty. The door opened, and a familiar voice followed. "You're early." Ethan turned. Sebastian Varelli stood behind him, composed, unmoved, like this moment had already been accounted for. Ethan's voice was lower now, controlled, but strained. "How long?" he asked. Sebastian didn't answer immediately. "Long enough for you to have known," he said finally. That response landed harder than accusation, because it wasn't emotional, it was factual. Ethan looked back toward the glass. "They're mine." Not a question, a realization. Sebastian nodded once. "Yes." Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy, because in that moment, everything shifted, not externally, internally. Ethan wasn't just facing a revelation, he was facing consequence. Ethan stepped back slowly, the weight of it settling in layers, not all at once, because understanding doesn't hit instantly. It builds, and each layer carries more impact than the last. "She didn't tell me," he said. Sebastian's gaze didn't shift. "You didn't ask." That ended the argument before it began, because it was true. Ethan had been present physically, but absent where it mattered. He replayed the final months of their marriage, the distance, the redirection, the way he had already begun detaching before officially ending things. Zariah had seen it. Of course she had. She always saw everything, and instead of confronting him, she adjusted, protected what needed to be protected, and left, not empty, but complete. Ethan let out a slow breath. "She left with everything," he said quietly. Sebastian corrected him. "No," he said. "She left with what was already hers." That distinction mattered, because it reframed everything. Ethan didn't lose something. He gave it away, without recognizing its value. And now, he understood the full extent of that decision. Not just the relationship, not just the structure she had built for him, but something far more permanent. His legacy, 2 lives, carrying his name, his blood, his future, and he had walked away from all of it, thinking he was gaining something better. Ethan looked toward the glass one last time. The children laughed at something, unaware, unaffected, stable, because they had been raised in an environment that didn't depend on his presence. And that realization was the most difficult one to accept, because it meant he wasn't needed, not by them, not by Zariah, not in the life he had once been central to. Ethan stepped back, Silence following him, because for the first time, he understood what loss actually looked like. Not loud, not dramatic, but complete. Clara Voss didn't leave suddenly. She adjusted. That was her pattern. Her connection to Ethan had never been emotional. It had been positional, aligned with growth, with access, with visibility. And once those elements began to shift, so did she. At first, it was subtle. Fewer appearances, less engagement, conversations that felt shorter, less invested. Ethan noticed, but initially, he ignored it, because his attention was elsewhere now, on the revelation, on the realization, on everything he had overlooked. But Clara? She noticed something different. Ethan's energy had changed, not upward, inward, distracted, unfocused, and that didn't align with her interests. "You've been distant," she said one evening. Ethan didn't deny it. "I've had a lot to process." Clara studied him. "And is it going to affect your position?" she asked. Not concern, assessment. Ethan looked at her, and in that moment, he saw it clearly. What she had always been, not support, not alignment, but reflection of what he represented at the time. And now, that reflection was shifting. "I don't know," he said honestly. Clara nodded slowly. Then, she stepped back, not dramatically, not emotionally, just strategically, because Clara didn't stay where certainty didn't exist. And Ethan was no longer certain. The decision didn't take long, because once clarity arrives, delay becomes pointless. Ethan knew what he needed to do, or at least, what he believed he needed to do. He went to see her, not impulsively, prepared, composed, but underneath, there was something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Zariah's environment had changed, not in scale, in presence. Everything reflected intention, structure, control. Ethan stood at the entrance for a moment before being allowed in, not because access was denied, but because access was no longer automatic. That, alone, shifted something in him. He stepped inside and saw her, Zariah, exactly as he remembered, and completely different, because now, there was nothing tied to him in her presence, no shared identity, no residual attachment, just her, whole, complete, unaffected. Ethan took a step forward. "Zariah." She looked at him, calm, neutral, acknowledging, but not inviting. "You've seen them," she said. Not a question, a confirmation. Ethan nodded. "I should have known." Zariah didn't respond, because that statement didn't change anything. "I want to be part of their lives," he continued. Zariah studied him, not emotionally, strategically. "Why?" she asked. Ethan hesitated, then, "Because they're mine." Zariah's expression didn't shift. "That's biology," she said. "Not responsibility." That stopped him, because it was accurate, and impossible to argue. "I made a mistake," Ethan said. Zariah nodded once. Yes. No comfort, no reassurance, just agreement. And that carried more weight than resistance. Silence settled between them, but this time, it wasn't neutral, it was final. Ethan stepped closer. "I can fix this," he said. Zariah held his gaze. "No," she replied. Simple, clear, unmovable. Ethan exhaled. "You're not even going to consider it?" Zariah's voice remained steady. "There's nothing to consider." A pause. "You made your decision when you had full access," she continued. "What you're asking for now is access without alignment." Ethan had no response, because she was right. Again, "I didn't understand what I had," he said quietly. Zariah's expression softened. Not emotionally, but in clarity. "You understood enough," she said. "You just valued something else more." That distinction closed the gap completely, because it removed misunderstanding from the equation. Ethan didn't lose Zariah by accident. He chose differently, and now, he was facing the result of that choice. Zariah stepped back slightly, not distancing, just reinforcing position. "You don't rebuild what you walked away from," she said. "You live with it." Ethan stood still, Because there was nothing left to say, no argument, no persuasion, no second chance, just reality. And for the first time, he accepted it, not because he wanted to, but because he had no control over it anymore. Zariah turned slightly, the conversation already concluded in her mind, and as Ethan stood there, he finally understood something he hadn't grasped before. Some things don't end in conflict. They end in clarity, and clarity doesn't negotiate. The meeting wasn't arranged through emotion. It was structured, deliberate, necessary. Ethan Cole requested it, not because he believed he could change anything, but because there was one thing left unresolved in his mind. Understanding, not of Zariah, but of where he stood now. The location was familiar, not to him, but to power. A private executive space, minimal design, controlled lighting, nothing excessive. The kind of environment where every detail served a purpose. Ethan arrived early, for once, not out of strategy, but anticipation, because this wasn't a negotiation. This was acknowledgement. He stood near the center of the room, hands at his sides, posture steady, but internally there was no illusion left. He wasn't in control here. The door opened. Sebastian Virelli entered first, as always. No rush, no wasted motion, no need to establish authority. It existed the moment he stepped in. Ethan turned, their eyes met, and immediately, the difference between them was clear. Not in wealth, not in status, in certainty. Sebastian didn't carry tension, didn't carry doubt. He wasn't here to gain anything. Ethan was, even if he didn't fully admit it. "You asked for this," Sebastian said calmly. Ethan nodded. "I did." A brief pause. Then, "Why?" Sebastian asked. No hostility, just precision. Ethan took a breath. "Because I need to understand where I stand." Sebastian studied him, not dismissive, not impressed, just assessing. "You stand exactly where your decisions placed you," he replied. The answer came without delay, without adjustment, and that was the difference. Sebastian didn't interpret outcomes. He recognized them. Ethan absorbed that, because there was no argument to make, no angle to shift, just reality. A moment passed. Then, the door opened again, and Zariah stepped in. Zariah didn't hesitate, didn't pause at the entrance. She walked in with the same composed presence she had carried from the beginning, not defensive, not distant, aligned. Her eyes moved briefly between both men, then settled, neutral, steady. Ethan felt it immediately. The absence of emotional weight, no resentment, no unresolved tension, and somehow, that felt heavier than anger ever could. "You wanted to speak," Zariah said, not a question, a prompt. Ethan nodded, but, for a moment, he didn't know where to start, because everything he had prepared felt irrelevant now. "I understand what I lost," he said finally. Zariah listened. No interruption, no reaction, just attention. "I didn't see it before," he continued. Not fully. Zariah's expression remained unchanged. "That's accurate," she said, not dismissive, just factual. Ethan exhaled slowly. "I thought I was moving forward," he added. "I thought I was choosing something better." Zariah tilted her head slightly. "Based on what?" she asked. Ethan paused, because now he understood the flaw in his thinking. "Perception," he admitted. Zariah nodded once. "That's consistent with your pattern. No emotion, no blame, just clarity." Sebastian remained silent, observing, because this wasn't his conversation to lead, it was his to witness. Ethan stepped forward slightly. "I know I can't undo it," he said. "I'm not asking for that." Zariah held his gaze. "Then what are you asking for?" Ethan hesitated. Then, "Acknowledgement," he said. Zariah didn't respond immediately, because she understood the weight of that word. He wasn't asking for reconciliation. He wasn't asking for access. He was asking to be seen differently than his actions reflected. And that required truth, not comfort. "You were acknowledged," Zariah said calmly. Ethan's expression tightened slightly. "That's not what I mean." Zariah didn't adjust her tone. It is, she replied. A pause. You were acknowledged when you were building, she continued. When you were uncertain. When your structure depended on more than your ambition. Each word landed with precision. You were acknowledged through support you didn't recognize, and stability you didn't question. Ethan didn't speak, because he couldn't deny it. And when that foundation was no longer visible to you, Zariah added, you reassigned its value. That was the truth. Clear, undeniable, delivered without hostility, and that made it heavier. Silence settled across the room. But this time, it carried completion. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, then looked back up. I see it now, he said. Zariah nodded. I know. That answer didn't carry validation. It carried conclusion. Ethan stepped back slightly, not because he was dismissed, but because he understood something fully for the first time. There was no space left for negotiation, no opening to re-enter what he had walked away from. Zariah's voice came again. Steady, measured, final. You didn't lose me. A brief pause. You let go of what made you. The words settled into the room. Not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. Ethan didn't respond, because there was nothing left to say. That sentence closed everything, not just the relationship, but the illusion he had been holding onto. Sebastian moved slightly, not forward, not toward either of them, just enough to signal presence. And that presence carried meaning, because, unlike Ethan, he had recognized Zariah before she needed to explain herself, before her value had to be proven through absence. That contrast was clear and intentional. Ethan looked between them, then nodded once, not in agreement, but in acceptance, because for the first time, he wasn't trying to change the outcome, he was acknowledging it, and that was the only thing left for him to do. Zariah turned, not abruptly, not emotionally, just complete. She walked toward the door, not looking back, because there was nothing behind her that required revisiting. Sebastian followed shortly after, not leading, not guiding, but aligned, and Ethan remained where he was, still aware, alone with the full understanding of what his decisions had cost him, not just in the past, but in everything that would come after. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that remind you of your worth.